Did we get Charles back?
Sal maybe.
Oh.
Okay. Dr. Morano, thank you for being so patient with us. It took a little longer than we expected.
No problem at all. Thank you.
Okay, on the agenda is a presentation. Dr. Morano is a colleague I've known for a period of time, off and on for several years, and he and I crossed paths. His background, he was actually Chief Operating Officer for Porter Hospital up in Millbury. He's also Vice President or Senior Vice President down to hospital system in South Carolina. When I had a chance to get down and meet with you there. And now at this point in time, I understand you also still have a PhD from Dartmouth College of Pharmacology. So he's well versed in this topic. I'm glad he's here to do a presentation to us. So with that ado, I'll have you begin the presentation, Sal.
Very good. Thank you. Nice to meet everyone. And Gary, just for the group,
Yeah.
what time frame do I have? I just want to be respectful of your time.
Probably if we can keep it down to no later than, let's see, two more other ones. Can we drill it down to about 35, 40 minutes? And do you want us to take the questions along the way, or do you want us to hold questions to the end?
No, please jump in with any questions, and I'll gear it to be about a half an hour, and then leave a little time at the end. Okay.
All right, thank you.
All right, I'll share my screen just to show some slides. As Mr. Merchant described, I'm a pharmacist, 30 years, hospital focus. In the last 7 years, I've been working with health systems and other large employers that are self-funded. So they pay the bill for their employee benefit plans. I wanted to share today just some highlights of what we're seeing in that employer space, and some strategies that employers are using to control that cost. So I'll provide a little bit of background, where the opportunities are to control some of these costs and to really manage best outcome. And then spend a little time on the two largest challenges that are really impacting employer plans or any self-funded plan, and that's the weight loss, diabetes, as well as gene therapies. And just as a disclosure, I work for a company called Alliant, but I pride myself on being very independent as a pharmacist. I have not received any financial support from the New Hampshire Prescription Drug Affordability Board or any pharmaceutical manufacturers. So I'm sure you're familiar with this, but pharmacy is the most widely utilized benefit. If you look across all different types of benefits, folks are getting prescriptions filled much more frequently than they're encountering any other benefit. And so it's really important that this benefit's managed aggressively, and it's consuming quite a bit of spend. So 30% of total healthcare spend is now pharmacy. We envision that easily getting to 40 or 50% within the next few years. And then within that category, about 60% of the cost is for specialty drugs. These are the biologics and injectables that only 1 or 2% of the members are taking. So if you imagine 1% of your population consuming about 50% of the cost. And it's growing very rapidly. So we've got a lot of challenges in the near horizon. In terms of cost, we put together just an easy math example. For every 1,000 employees or members on a plan, you're talking about 11 times that in terms of prescriptions. So for every 1,000 members, you'd have 11,000 prescriptions, about $1,200 drug spend per member. That's a national average. And then 60% of that would be specialties. So for this group of 1,000 members, you're talking about 1.2 million in spend, half of that with specialty. And then the big challenge is collecting those rebates. So I'm sure you've heard that rebates are available from drug manufacturers. The PBM contract really needs to be finally worded so that you're getting the employer and the plan sponsors getting those dollars back. But we estimate about 30% of the total spend should come back as rebates. Now, the landscape is busy and challenging, as you all know. There are many drugs in the specialty pipeline. So the FDA has taken a stance of approving many of these drugs, but specifically for rare conditions with an abbreviated approval process. So there's many specialty drugs coming to market. There's an explosion of orphan drugs and gene therapies. We've struggled with biosimilars. They really haven't come to market fast enough. For example, with Humera, it's been many years, and with legal delays, we're finally starting to see some of the biosimilars come to market for Humera. And then on the bottom left, the biggest news for most self-funded plans this year is Wegovy, Mounjaro, Ozempic, Saxenda. These are GLP-1 agonists. They're injected drugs for the most part. And they were started to be used for type 2 diabetes, but now because they help folks lose weight, there's been a big shift in terms of utilizing these drugs for weight loss. And they come at a cost, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And on the bottom right, I'll just focus on a couple of things, the disruptors. There are a number of positive disruptors in the pharmacy space. Mark Cuban has opened his own mail order home delivery pharmacy. Amazon has entered into the pharmacy space. And then, of course, GoodRx is a big coupon provider that helps folks with lower costs on drugs. And so we view these as change agents. They're really changing the way pharmacy is managed, particularly for generics. And I'm going to pause there, just see if there's any questions at this point.
I have one quick question on your last slide, and it's a stupid question, so I apologize for it. But you said that 25 to 30% of the spend should come back as rebates, which is about 300,000.
Yes.
Why do we have this system of rebates? Why isn't, if rebates should be coming back, why isn't it just priced 25 to 30% lower?
Yeah, no, great question. And actually a huge focus area for us as well. We would all prefer a model where the drug was just 25% or 30% less expensive and there were no rebates.
Right.
But through history, pharmaceutical manufacturers and PBMs have developed this program. One reason is because for a drug to be preferred on the preferred formulary, like a preferred brand, rebates at one time were used to sort of get that placement on the formulary. And I think the other reason why is our drug pricing policy in the United States is very fragmented, right? Medicaid is dependent on rebates. Foreign countries negotiate their drug prices completely differently than the United States. Medicaid has a most favored nation pricing clause. So there's a lot of infrastructure reasons why, but I agree with you 100%. If there was one law that would really add a lot of transparency to pharma, it would be, eliminating rebates and going to a straight net price. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Quick follow-up to that question. Wait, how much of that 25 to 30% gets back to patients?
So
How much
that's,
of it-
yeah, very good question. So in most traditional benefits models, none of that gets back to patients, except the plan can have lower premiums, right? So if the plan is getting back $300,000 in rebates, they factor that into the calculation of premiums for the benefit. If all of a sudden the rebates stopped coming in or the manufacturers refused to pay those rebates, then members would pay more for their premium. Now, there are some plans that do point of sale rebates, which means like if I was the patient, I went to the pharmacy, my price of the drug would actually include the rebate up front. And we like that from a fairness perspective. But what we don't like about it is that helps the members who are on expensive brand name drugs, but does not help the members that are on generics, because most generics do not have rebates. And it will also drive up premiums. So it will kind of hit the larger group of employees with a higher premium and higher out-of-pocket cost, whereas only the folks that are on the very expensive drugs will get the rebate. And like I said, the specialty is driving a lot of those rebate dollars. So that's another area that employers and actually some state legislatures have proposed here in Georgia. I'm based in Atlanta now, but Georgia did have a bill that would have required point of sale rebates to be passed through. I think 2 years in a row, it was ultimately not voted through because of the reasons I mentioned, you know, the hit to the plan, the premiums, the members, et cetera. So. Okay, so this is our big picture slide, you know, really helping particularly employers understand why is it that drug costs in the United States are so out of line with the rest of the world. And I think there's four main levers. The first is regulatory. So the Affordable Care Act did many good things, you know, from a patient perspective, not having coverage limits, requiring coverage of essential health drugs, you know, maximizing out of pockets, all those things were very beneficial to members. But what it did is, in my opinion, it did create an environment where drug manufacturers could increase prices and plans would still have to cover the drug no matter how much it cost. You know, classic economic supply and demand, it created a lot of demand, right? So now the drug manufacturers can essentially raise prices. And there was nothing in the Affordable Care Act or in any legislation thereafter that limited the ability of drug manufacturers to increase drug prices. Then on the top right, advances in pharmaceuticals. I started my career at Dartmouth in a lab studying retinoblastoma, a type of pediatric cancer. And some of those products that we were working on in the test tubes in 1993 and 94, you know, eventually made their way through to become new therapies. And now there's this, you know, huge amount of drug research that is producing really life-changing therapies, and they come at a significant cost. On the bottom right, I mentioned it, unregulated pharmaceutical pricing and inflation. So for example, with Ozempic, which is the diabetes drug, I researched this and it's very difficult to find, but in the UK and in France and in Denmark, that product is about $85 a month, US equivalent. In the United States, it's about $1,000 a month. So you've got to ask, you know, how can it be so much higher in the US compared to Canada or Europe and other countries? And then on the bottom left, public and provider demand. I think if you watch any TV at all, you'll know that there's unrelenting advertising. And even to the point where I think all of us know what the Ozempic theme song is, right? I mean, we probably know a lot of the theme songs, we know the characters. And so tremendous amount of, there are four forces, they all come together. And now we have employers that are spending thousands and thousands, not millions of dollars a year on drug treatment. So what do we do about it? Well, many different consultants and advisors and brokers, and I speak just from the perspective as a pharmacist, there are the middlemen, right? So the PBM, the pharmacy benefits manager, is who we hire to manage the pharmacy benefit for most health plans. And on the top, we have the very large integrated players, you know, like United Healthcare and then Cigna. They recently acquired PBMs to be part of their offering. So for example, Cigna and Express Scripts came together a couple of years ago. Then we have the mid-sized transparent, and these tend to be smaller PBMs that are very focused on transparency, full pass-through, customize, you know, flexibility with customization. And so you may recognize some of these names. Then the next row are what I call the startups. These are the disruptors that many of them are private equity funded, really smart people who came from some of the big companies and decided to do something different. And they usually have something about them that they want to feel unique about. Like, for example, maybe like Capital X, they use NADAC pricing, which is a national acquisition cost pricing. Or Empirics uses a lot of physician order entry. Brightway has navigators that help patients navigate really complicated drug questions. So these are the disruptors. And then on the far bottom are the RX point solutions, which means they're really not PBMs, but they take a piece of the pharmacy benefit and they master it. So for example, Amazon, as we all know, is really good at getting product to your door quickly. And so they're able to do prescription drugs very efficiently. Archimedes is one that I've worked with. They will carve out and only manage the specialty. And they do so much more aggressively than your standard traditional PBM. So a lot of players, but I show that slide to show this, which is if an artist painted this many years ago and it was for a completely different reason, but it does depict where we are with the PBM space now. We've got the big ships, and then we have medium-sized boats, and then we have people that have fallen overboard and they're swimming in the water, which has sharks in it. But what's really interesting, if you look at the flags, the wind is pushing the flags all in one direction. And the direction that we're going with pharmacy is transparency, lowest net cost, pass-through rebates, all the things that you asked about, and removing some of the costs wherever possible. And so we have this national initiative to really address pharmacy spend, and the different players are going to react to it different. Some of these small boats can navigate those changes much more rapidly than a really large national health plan. But ultimately, all of those have to move. Any questions at this point?
Also, I have a couple. Hold on.
Yeah.
Sorry, back on the evolving pharmacy marketplace.
Yeah.
The mid-sized, transparent, and I guess actually the potential disruptors, we understand how the large players like CVS, Caremark, and Express Scripts have traditionally made their money, but how do the mid-sized, transparent, sounds like they're trying to do, in quotes, the right thing, but how are they actually remaining profitable if they're not doing what traditional PBMs have done?
Yeah, no, very good question. So the funding mechanism, the way PBMs make money is three ways. One is they charge you a per member per month fee, which is sort of an admin fee. The second way is that they make money on spread. So if a retail pharmacy fills a prescription and they submit a claim for $100, the plan might actually pay $110, right? And there's a $10 spread between what the pharmacy's paid versus what the plan pays. And that's been very much scrutinized. That's a practice that I think most of us would agree is all it does is it squeezes the pharmacies, but still the plan is paying full amount, right? And we've had a number of states that have actually, moved towards limiting that or in some way, restricting it. And then the third way is through rebates. So if you remember, we said a plan should get 30% of the rebates back. If the contract's not worded carefully, and if we don't audit them, they may only pass through 20% of the rebates and keep the 10% for themselves. So those were the traditional models for revenue. The mid-sized, transparent, and the disruptors, they say we don't do any of that for the most part. Our sole source of revenue will be a per member per month fee. And usually it's $2, $3, $4 per member per month. That's their revenue. And then if they do a prior authorization, they'll charge for that. If they do an appeal, they'll charge for that. And so when we do our contract analysis, we have to factor in, what the revenue is and which model makes the most sense. Okay.
Follow-up question to that. What percentage on this page are for-profit organizations?
So they're all for profit. I think Mark Cuban might be a public benefit corp, if I remember correctly, but all are for profit. There are some that are not for profit and or structured in a way that they're limited profit. But you're absolutely right. I mean, none of these companies would exist if there wasn't for the profit motive. And your questions are exactly the types of questions that employers are asking, right? Because they know that there's these gray areas, which is why a good plan every 3 to 5 years will do a competitive RFP and evaluate the different options. There are 4 different ways that a plan can buy pharmacy benefits. They can do what's called a direct carve out, which means you go to Optum, Express Scripts, CVS, and you negotiate as a standalone client for that contract. Then there's direct carve in, which means you have, let's say, Aetna or Cigna or Anthem or Blue Cross Blue Shield as your medical carrier, and you combine the pharmacy benefit into that benefit as a carved in benefit. So that's option 2. And then option 3 and 4 are variants of that, but you buy in group purchasing. So it's part of a coalition or a national group of plans that have gotten together and negotiate together to try to get better value. In my experience, working with employers, unless you've got about 100,000 lives, very challenging to negotiate the terms and conditions that you would want on a contract in a direct carve out. So there is rationale for banding together with other plans to try to negotiate more, more value out of the contract. In addition to the contract, I want to share what a good plan management includes a lot of layers. So on the foundation is your contract, right? You want to have really good discounts. You want to have very good rebate guarantees. You want to have a low admin fee, but that's only 35% of your cost risk, because 55 to 65% of a plan's cost risk is on utilization and waste, right? So if you have a really good contract, but 25% of your prescriptions are being overfilled, then your bigger challenge is your overfill, not your contract, right? So we do a lot of work with plans on clinical and formulary management, delivery channel and plan design. Is a 90-day fill really always the best thing for a plan? We work with employers that have 65% turnover. So if you fill a 90-day supply of Ozempic, that's $4,000. And if the member decides they don't want to work for the company anymore, the day after they get that 90-day supply of Ozempic, you basically have $3,000 worth of drug that's left the organization, right? So our 90-day fill is always the right thing. Some employers are thinking maybe 90 days is too much. It's creating waste. When I was at Porter, we used to do brown bag sessions, and we'd invite seniors to come in with what I thought was going to be a small brown bag of medications. It turned out to be a very large garbage bag of medications that literally we had to figure out with the Vermont State Police how to dispose of, because some of these things were controlled substances, and it just. So I question, how much waste in the United States. Probably, I would estimate 20 to 25% of all dispensed drugs are wasted, and a lot of that's driven by too much mail order, too much retail 90. And then continuous monitoring, knowing what's going on a week-by-week basis. Are there any high-cost claimants? Is there a new hemophilia patient? Is there a new hereditary angioedema patient? Some of these conditions can bring $1 million a year in pharmacy costs. And then due diligence, helping members, market checks, audits. So the point of this is to say, yes, the contract is important and the choice of a PBM is important. But I would say if you had a terrible PBM contract with a terrible PBM, but you did all of these other things really well, you're actually, the plan is probably going to be run better than if you only focused on the contract and didn't worry about all the utilization. Does that make sense? All right, so applying these principles, this is a cross-section of a number of different plans where applying these principles generates savings. So you can see that these are plans from a variety of industries or backgrounds. Some of them are very small, and some of them are larger. And it was pretty much irregardless of the PBM, whether it was CVS, Optum, Express Scripts, Blue Cross Blue Shield. It's very possible to remove drug costs by managing the plan more judiciously. And we're not, and I strongly advocate for the patient. As a pharmacist, we don't want to have a benefit that nobody can get prescriptions filled. It's got to be, a generous benefit. But by removing waste and making sure that patients are on the right drug for them, there's always savings. So, all right, very briefly, yes.
Question.
Thank you, Dr. Moreno. I'd like to ask a question about the triangle slide, 2 slides back.
Yes.
At the bottom, you list a total cost function, right, is equal to unit cost. And is it truly multiplicative, unit cost times utilization times mixed intensity, or is that just kind of a graphical representation of the factors?
Yeah, it's graphical. I mean, yeah, the math is probably unit cost. Unit cost. I think what we're trying to illustrate is that, and I think you know what I'm illustrating, is that unit cost is important, but it's not as important as utilization and mix.
Right, I'm just calling into question the science, because it looks like unit cost times utilization, I think, with specific concern to those, the weight loss drugs, the GLP agonists.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me give you an example. If your total cost profile is 1,000, one being 100%, one, if your utilization, if your cost went down by 5%, so you need 0.95, but your utilization went up by 20%, so 1.2. If you multiply those out, it kind of gives you the illustration we're talking about. All right, any other questions?
No. Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So again, just a picture to try to explain how we're feeling about gene therapies and weight loss. Literally, these are trains coming down the track. I was going to say high speed, but these don't look too high speed, but they're coming down the track. Weight loss is here now. We're in the midst of that spend, and then gene therapies are not that far behind. So these are the four main drugs: Saxenda, Ozempic, Wegovy, Mounjaro. They've been in the market for some time, although Mounjaro is the newest. And efficacy, some of these drugs can lose, your patient can lose 20% weight in 18 months, which is significant. The cost for each is listed here, about $16,000 for Wegovy. Mounjaro is a little bit less, $13,000. But we are literally seeing employers' costs for these drugs shoot up 20%, 30%. This is one particular employer I work with, that the first data point is for the entirety of 2022, they had about $60,000 per week in spend. And then we've been tracking it week by week, and you can see, and actually you can see the 90-day fill pattern, right? These are the sort of the peaks and troughs, but they're spending upward of $120,000 per week on just this one drug class, and it's growing significantly. So just from last year to this year, it's doubled. And so what is a plan going to have to do? They're going to have to potentially raise their premiums. They may have to put more limits in place. And this manufacturer says there's no end in sight. I think we're seeing the tip of the iceberg when it comes to diabetes and weight loss drug utilization. And maybe less so in New Hampshire, but down in the Southeast, we do have a higher prevalence of obesity and diabetes. It is now the #1 drug for most plans that I'm working with.
Question?
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick question. I can't remember whether or not this is the case, but plans can no longer charge more for coverage to patients who are high utilizers.
Right.
Is that correct?
That is correct. Yeah.
So it's sort of needs blind. So
Yeah.
that means that the entire pool of participants in the plan have to carry the cost of these skyrocketing drugs. And is this group still part of that? What is it, 1 to 2% of the actual people enrolled in the plans?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. So the GLP-1s are not considered specialty, which boggles the mind because they're injectable, they have to be refrigerated, they're expensive, but for the most part, they're considered traditional drugs. So we now have employers seeing a double hit. They're getting the specialty drug costs, and that's for things like Humera and Skyrizi and some of the injectable rheumatoid arthritis, and they're getting hit there, but they're also now this traditional is really exploding. And then what was the second question? I think, oh, in terms of the premiums, yeah. So when an employer plan sets premiums, they cannot charge somebody more for having a chronic condition. But I do know that if someone is a smoker, there can be premium adjustments for nicotine use. But that doesn't carry over to anything else like overeating or other negative behaviors, just smoking.
So quick follow-up, who determines that it is not considered a specialty drug? Is that federal?
It's actually set by the manufacturer and the PBMs. So there are, the reason why a PBM would want a manufacturer and a PBM would want a drug to be specialty if they feel that it needs to be dispensed through a very special pharmacy.
Dr. Moreno,
Yes,
I have yet to see a agreed upon definition of what a specialty drug is.
I agree
Do you
with
know
you.
of one?
I
It
agree.
really comes down, like I said, it comes down to how the PBM manufacturer, there is no, I'm not aware of anyways, is a national recognized definition.
No, I totally agree with you. And that should be done because there are a lot of repercussions, rebates and all different types of repercussions for that.
There's language that in the CMS definition usually used to treat rare conditions, and that may be the pathway for which it doesn't
Yeah.
qualify because diabetes.
Yeah.
type 2,
Obesity is not particularly rare.
Dr. Moreno, I have a question, again, stemming off of Dr. Sherman's questions about indication-specific pricing or disparities of such. You mentioned that these GLP-1 agonists are used to treat type 2 diabetes and also obesity. Is the coverage and the cost the same for both indications?
So employer plans have the option not to cover obesity management. It's not an essential health benefit in the United States. It's been considered for years and years, quote, cosmetic. So of my clients I work with, about 70% do not cover weight loss at all. And then 30% do. But what's really interesting is if the plan covers weight loss, we're seeing members using Saxenda and Wegovy, which have the FDA approval for weight loss. Incidentally, Wegovy is exactly the same drug as Ozempic. It's the same molecule, just a different brand name. But if the plan does not cover weight loss, what we're seeing is a tremendous surge in newly diagnosed diabetic patients. Because the PA criteria for Ozempic and Mounjaro requires you have a diagnosis of diabetes. And so the patients either now have prediabetes, metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, or they're coming out with a check mark on the PA that says, yeah, they have diabetes. And I think some of what's driving that is desire for the weight loss, even if they don't have diabetes.
Thank you.
Quick test, a technical question. Thank you very much. We're talking about the graph that you have up. The vertical axis is expenditures. The title says utilization. So if you're presuming that the price doesn't change or the cost doesn't change over the time.
Right. Yeah, over this period span of time, the price did not change. This is actually from a database that I keep. There's also script count and there's also day supply, but all the lines all go up. The data is pretty compelling that the utilization is doubled. All right.
It's utilization of dollars, not units.
But it's equivalent
Yes.
because the dollars are staying.
And the number of patients. So not only is it the dose and the frequency per patient, but the number of patients has definitely gone up. And I think any other pharmacist in the room knows this. I know a drug is popular when I'm mowing my lawn and my neighbor walks over to ask me a question about Ozempic. So, and I'm getting a lot of those questions like, can I lose 40 pounds before my daughter's wedding? Or could I lose this weight that I haven't been able to lose, but I'm in great shape otherwise. So there's a lot of interest in it. The one that is not getting as much media attention, but I think is going to be a very significant hit is gene therapies. And like I mentioned, I started my career working in biotech and I understand this field and I'm very, very close to it. There are 5 currently FDA approved gene therapies. This is different than a drug. This is actually taking genetic material and using either viral vectors or some other technology, trying to replace or repair damaged DNA that's causing a condition that's hereditary, right? So if you look at the names of the products and then you see the diseases, these are very rare conditions. Zolgensma is used for spinal muscular atrophy, very low number of patients per year. Luxturna is for a rare form of blindness. Zynteglo is for beta thalassemia. Hemgenix starts to get a little bit more prevalent because it's for hemophilia B. But what's shocking about these products is that they're very, very expensive. And this is for a single administration. 2.1 million up to 3.5 million. The Luxturna looks like a good deal, but that's per eye. So by the time you do both eyes, you're actually at close to 2 million, right? This does not include the hospitalization, the administration charges. I know for Zynteglo, for example, you have to be hospitalized for 6 to 8 weeks because there's a bone marrow transplant kind of procedure that has to happen. What concerns me as a clinical pharmacist, though, is when you look at the efficacy of these products, most are very, very modest. So this is not a situation where you get an injection of a gene therapy and you cure a disease. For the most part, what you do is you get the treatment and then you maybe hopefully improve the outcome a bit, right? And that's the challenging part, is that this is science that has not fully matured, right? And so a lot of these products don't work as well. But the fear is that many more of them are coming to market. So this chart here just shows our prediction for 2024, 25, 26. And depending on how many lives you have, the likelihood that a plan will see at least one of these claims is quickly getting to 50%. And if you have an employer, let's say of 1,000 lives, and their spend would triple from one claim, that becomes very, very unsustainable. And so it causes us to question sort of the business model, right? Or at least want to understand it. And where do most of these gene therapies and biotech products come from? Publicly funded, non-for-profit academic research, which is great. We all want that. As soon as there's a product that can have patent value, it's patented from a biotech company, a lot of times in partnership with pharma. Then there's an FDA, expedited FDA approval process with limited efficacy data because these are orphan products. And then they come to market with exorbitant pricing, which are unsustainable. So what we're talking about with plans is, yes, we want gene therapies for these rare conditions, but if they're not really fully effective and they're so expensive that it would actually jeopardize a plan's ability to provide basic primary care, then are these products, can they be covered? There's a tremendous global cost shift of these products. In France, in Australia, in Asia, these gene therapies are covered, but they're at a fraction of the cost, 20% of what we're seeing in the United States. So it really brings up a lot of questions about global cost shifting, equity and sustainability.
Dr. Martin, we have,
Yep.
if I could, question.
Yeah, back to your graph, the previous slide.
Yes.
There are 3 years in the legend at the bottom, but
Yeah.
6 graphs. What's the relationship between the colors on the graph and the years?
Yeah, so this is 24, 25, 26, 27, 28, 29. It's just that the legend got cut off. So,
Gotcha.
so as the years go by, basically we get more and more prevalence, right?
Thank you.
No, you're welcome.
Quick question. Just a really quick question back on the current FDA-approved gene therapies slide. I think it was 15. That estimated cost, are these one-time administrations or are they repeated? You said this is the cost of a single dose
Yes,
for administration,
that's correct.
right?
Yeah, these all are single administration. So you get a gene therapy and you're done. Now,
Okay.
we may end up in a scenario where someone adopted Zolgensma, or let me use Zynteglo. Someone took Zynteglo in 2023 and it didn't quite work great. In the future, there might be a second gene therapy that might be tried for that patient. But at this point, my understanding is you get this therapy, you're pretty much not eligible for another gene therapy. We've also heard that sometimes you get the gene therapy and you still need treatment that was very, very expensive. So like, for example, hemophilia, you can live a healthy life with hemophilia factors, things like Advate and they're basically factor drugs, but they're very expensive. So the reason why the drug manufacturer says it's worth 3.5 million is because if you get this gene therapy, you will no longer need the $1 million per year factor therapy. But what we're seeing in the data is that after a few years, the gene therapy may start to wear off. And now this patient needs to go back on traditional drug therapy. So you're paying for the gene therapy and not really getting the return on investment from a plan perspective. So a lot of discussion here. We're actually working with plans that have said we cannot sustain this cost. If this cost comes to our plan, we will have to make such drastic cuts or increases in our premiums that we can no longer be competitive. So I think, unfortunately, these gene therapies are going to be the hottest issues in probably 25, 26. Really hasn't hit yet because there aren't that many products. But there's last time I counted, there's about 80 gene therapies in the pipeline. And we are optimistic. We're not optimistic that the price is going to come down. We think that the cost is actually going to continue to increase. So one of our big challenges is, yes.
Oh, just a quick question on the previous slide. That publicly funded, not-for-profit academic research, this whole model of progression of drug therapy is nothing new. And
Right.
I've always sat back and watched many drugs go through, I'm a physician, and watched many drugs go through the pipeline, recognizing that not only is some of the academic research, or is most of the academic research publicly funded, but even some of the marketing is publicly funded or subsidized along the way. Is there any has anybody done studies of the net cost to the biotech companies for the actual development and launch of their products that they didn't have to pay for because it was publicly funded?
It's very challenging to get those numbers. But what I have heard because I work with health systems, we do a lot of we meet with a lot of manufacturers and push back on them on cost. That the dollar investment you would think that was going to R&D is actually lower than you would expect. And there are some published articles out there on the cost of advertising actually being their largest expense in the United States. So just based on what I've read and seen, it seems like the argument that we need to do this to have drug discovery is probably not as true as it maybe was once. Particularly when you look at the fact that they can sell these products in other countries for much, much lower. I think the biggest issue is a cost shifting issue. Is if UK can negotiate a gene therapy for $300,000 and we pay $3 million, then that probably is an easier target than to put a price cap. In other words, it's probably an easier target to say the cost shift between our economy and similar economies cannot exceed some reasonable ratio. It would
And your
yeah.
last box did not have in there profit.
Yeah, that's a good point. It should.
Because I think that's clearly the driver.
Yeah, I'm going to add that. You're absolutely right. That's the number one, obviously. So we, like I'll give you an example. I know we're tight on time, but Novo Nordisk, Ozempic, they make Ozempic, Wegovy. They literally have folks that are teaching patients how to file appeals, right? That's all funded by them. They have patient assistance programs that help someone get started on the drug for 3 months, but then the drug coupon wears out, and now you have a patient that says, I've been on the drug for 3 months, and they file an appeal to continue therapy. So there are a lot of dollars being spent that are probably not as constructive as they could be, and certainly profit is a huge motive there.
We need to begin to wrap up. So.
Yes. So I think in closing, these are the conversations we're having with employers and municipalities. It's going to be a challenging few years. I think there's a real hunger out there by employers and members to see something rational that looks like it's actually going to help. recently the insulins, the prices came down on insulins. That was a combination of political pressure, but also a rebate strategy that drug manufacturers needed to take. But I think there's a real, the speeding trains, I'm going to go back to that slide to close. Weight loss is going to be big, but gene therapies is going to be even bigger. And I think we need to come together at the state and federal level to figure out how exactly we're going to be able to manage this. So I really appreciate your time, and I'm certainly available for any questions or any more discussion.
Thank you very much for the presentation today. I learned a lot from it. As always, it's a pleasure to hear from you and learn from you as well. So I wish you and the family the best. And thank you again for spending some time with us this morning.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful day. All right,
Take
bye-bye.
care now. Before I go into the next one, I wanted to.
I can get more of it.
Well, you can get it later.
Oh, okay.
All right, I got you out there. Okay. You have a time.
I just have to leave it.
And then it's, I don't know whether Cindy's still in the city, Roosevelt still on the,
Here.
no, okay. Hopefully she'll come back. When she jumps back.
I think she had said it earlier. She's a panelist and she's not there. And I think she said she had to leave earlier.
Yeah, all right. So we'll tackle that when we get down to the MOU. All right. Dr. Woodward, you did some interesting number crunching.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
As in, on your mark, get set, go.
sure. Take it off.
Yeah, I'm Bob Woodward, not the real one, professor at Health Economics Emeritus at UNH and an alternative member of the board. I am a data cruncher and do it for fun. I'll say slide. Thanks. I have kind of three sections of a quick report of observations. One, to look at the Medicaid overall expenditure pattern between 18 and 2022. To a second section, yeah, let's get it up here. Next slide. Yeah, the second section is to say something about the 50 prescription drugs in Medicaid with the highest expenditures. And the third is to say something, some observations, these are all preliminary observations about the prescription drugs, the 50 prescription drugs with the greatest expenditure change between 2018 and 22. That's a quick outline. This group is pretty well knowledgeable about the New Hampshire Comprehensive Health Information System, or CHIS data. It is, these are a couple of quick summary points of the types of carriers in that data system. Medicaid is probably the one that is the most complete data set. I just would say a thank you to Andrew Chalsma and Mary Fields of DHHS. Of course, if there are any screw ups or misrepresentations, it's my fault, not theirs. So just by way of background, when I use the word expenditure, I'm talking about what they report on the data set as total payments. When I talk about utilization, I'm talking about dose days or days of doses. So that it takes out the difference between a prescription that's a 90-day prescription from a prescription that's a 30-day prescription. I'm looking at utilization as days covered by the prescriptions. Yeah, and also if you have questions or comments, please pipe up. I'm quite willing to handle stuff as good as along. The dose days or utilization, of course, are affected by the number of patients, the prescription per patient, and the dose days per prescription. Those three go in to end up with the dose days overall. And then the total payments per dose day measures cost. So when I talk about cost, it's the cost per dose day. When I talk about utilization, I'm talking about all the doses which are determined, of dose days, which are determined by the number of patients, the prescriptions per patient, and the dose days per prescription. We're talking about Medicaid. So of course, Medicaid pays the vast percentage of all of the, please.
So again, to be clear, Medicaid, because it doesn't have much of a deductible for the patient's point of view, 99% of the drug cost is borne by the state.
Yes,
Yeah.
no, it's 50% of the 99%.
But the state initially pays 99%, but gets some of it back matching grant.
From the feds.
So that's,
Yeah, it depends on whether they're Medicaid or Medicaid expansion.
Yes, we have data on both in this data set. So exactly what that percentage is would be determined by the contract with the managed care Medicaid
And
plan.
Senator Rosenwald, the number that she uses was 52%.
I'm saying roughly in order to
So I
do
think-
two.
So I think you're right. That's what I'm saying.
So next slide. These now are the observations on Medicaid overall expenditures. 2018, 2022, the number on this data set grew from 223 million to $304 million, which represents an $80 million additional expenditure, which is a 36% increase over that time, which is about 8% a year annualized growth. Next slide. So that's the overall expenditure. Question number one is how much of this increase is attributable to utilization and how much is attributable to a cost? So there's 36% of the overall change occurred because of utilization. That is 24 or 28 out of that 36 was extra dose days. And 7.5% due to the increase in cost per dose overall. So observation number one, most of the increase in expenditure is utilization, not increase in cost per dose.
dose.
Per day, cost per dose day. Next slide. So again, the utilization can then be deconstructed into additional number of patients, additional number of prescriptions per patient, and additional number of dose days per prescription. This is the breakdown. So of that 28%, 10% was an increase in patients. 4.5 of the overall 28 was an increase in prescriptions per patient, and 12% in the increase in dose days per prescription. And when you those numbers were calculated separately. When you multiply the 1.10 times the 1.045 times the 1.12, you get this 1.28, which is close to what was measured directly. Just to give you a perspective of how that compounding of percentages works. Next slide. So now we're changing from the overall picture to looking at the highest 50 cost. And if you look at the top 10 or the top 25 or the top 50 drugs, you see a large numbers. So the top 10 in 18 went from 24.5 of the total to 26.9. If you look at the top 25, that includes the top 10, you see 41 to 45% of the total package, which itself was increasing. And if you look at the top 50, you go from 57 to 61% of the total increasing package. Please.
Going back to your observations, it just crossed my mind that because of COVID, we saw a huge increase in enrollment in Medicaid, which is now being not corrected, but it's, people who no longer qualified are being moved off Medicaid, but before they weren't. Was utilization a function? Did it increase because enrollment increased?
So go back to the slide that it has the 20 Medicaid, go back another. So the 28.4% utilization increase was a 10% increase in patients.
Okay, so this is.
That's it.
I got it.
Yep.
Thanks. Sorry, that was a stupid question.
Yep. No, it's not stupid. It's
So there was some factor.
some
to
factor to
enrollment.
number of patients. Exactly
Okay,
right.
good.
But of the 28, I mean, it's less than half.
Right. Got it. That's super helpful. Thanks.
So go back to the Humera slide. You had it right there. The winner is Humera. It increased itself from 18.7 million or to 18 point, which represented 6.2% of all Medicaid expenditures in 2022, which was 139% increase. That's not a 39, that's 139% increase over the 2018 expenditures. Due to, here you have a 45% increase in patients, a 36% increase in the cost per dose day, and a 22% increase in dose days per patient. So here you see the majority of the large increase attributable to patients and to the cost per dose day. That's Humera.
So the exciting news would be if our previous speaker was talking about, Humera comes as a generic,
There are
should
big
see a
opportunities.
drop in cost per
Yes.
dose day.
With a lag that it just in general, the availability of a generic doesn't immediately translate to reduced costs.
Eventually, yeah.
But that's one of the things you talked about before, is that in the small molecule market, which is normally talked about as generics, there is a tremendous uptake, if you will, allowing the pharmacist to substitute a generic for a brand name when it was available. And that has had tremendous savings to any organization. Challenge, though, is when we look at biosimilars, is how do we increase the adoption rate of biosimilars to do the same thing with biosimilars we saw with the small molecules on the generic side. Which goes back to showing you a point here, is that when you have this kind of introduction of a generic, how can we foster a greater market adoption of the generic or the biosimilar to help save money?
One of the interesting observations on generics versus brand name drugs is a comparison between the prices that Americans pay for generics versus the prices that Americans pay for brand name drugs compared to Canada. And if you compare them, what I found very interesting, not in this report at all, is Americans pay through the whatever part of your body you want to pick on, for the brand names, but our generics are cheaper
Yes.
than the Canadian generics.
And just, I don't want to tell you time-wise, but one of the things that's happening in the generic market, to your point, is we're now starting to experience a very severe shortage of cancer drugs. A lot of them are injectables because we've been so successful in squeezing the margin on those drugs, nobody wants to make them anymore. So
There's also the comparison with the brand name and the one of the statins, Pfizer, I think it was, had built such an efficient manufacturing plant for, I forget which statin it was, that the potential competition knew that as soon as they would enter the drug, the Pfizer had the ability to produce it cheaper. And so there wasn't any real market because they'd be up. Oh, okay, next slide. The actually, one of the sort of going into this question about, see if I lost it. Yeah, the next slide is these are drugs that appeared in 2022 for which were not available in 2018. So all of these drugs were not on the Medicare. Actually, Medicaid spent zero on these drugs. I don't know the logistics, but Medicaid spent zero. They were not in the data set in 2018. Next slide, please. Humera is the winner, both in terms of the magnitude of the increase and the magnitude of the expenditure. Humera is the blue line there at the top. This graph looks entirely different if you do it in logs, so you can see growth rates. But I left it this way because we're talking about expenditures, not growth rates. And Humera is by far the best. Yeah, I think my legend is still there. And the most interesting, the next slide is my last slide, observation that I had was when you looked at the expenditures on the top 50 drugs in 2022, that the increase in expenditures on those top 50 drugs was greater than the overall increase in expenditures for Medicaid as a whole. What that means is there are a bunch of drugs on which Medicaid spend less. And indeed, of the 137 additional, of the 80 million increase overall, there was a $57 million decrease in drugs in other than the top 50 expenditure category. So that's an area which I think deserves a little bit of research. It is more than I got done for this presentation. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Questions?
Questions? Thank you very much for this. It's helpful to see the data and the analysis behind it and the explanation as well.
So just in terms of future presentation, one of the, I guess, the two biggest take homes I have from today's two presentations are that, I'm trying to remember that pyramid where, what do you say, 35% of the driver is of cost increase is the actual price or the PBM or whatever, but the remainder, the savings to be had are based on oversight and how tightly you manage the supply and how much is being doled out, how sort of the case management, all that kind of stuff balled up into one. And Medicaid, the savings would clearly be to the state. They're currently managed, I believe, by the MCOs that are contracted with the state. Would it make sense to have a presentation from state managers of state employees and those kinds, whoever's managing those plans, but also maybe from the MCOs on what they're doing on the 65% that above that bottom rung of the pyramid, or whether they even agree with it. What our first.
Yes.
is, you know, because I think one group, which is kind of in a way, not the elephant in the room, but really at some point we need to be hearing from them are the state plan managers.
Right, I did speak to, it's back to the same thing as, I think it's, to your point is, when you start talking about the PBM, the contracts and so forth, is having them collectively, probably hearing from them with Sal as well, and talking about how they're gonna try to manage that other 65%. Because when I look back here in this graph, this chart,
Yeah, that's the one that really
is, these are all PBMs, but if you look at what's here, the improvement they have over the existing PBM is in 20%. That's a huge impact. So the question I'd ask is, how are they getting a 20% additional savings when you're looking at PBMs like CVS, Optima RX, and Express Scripts and so forth? How are they saving at 20%? Because I keep hearing time and time again, the PBMs do everything they can. So if they're doing everything they can, that improvement should be marginal.
right. So what I guess my take home message from this table is that regardless of the actual PBM that's managing the benefit, there is a plan management that could result in an additional 20% of savings, cost savings. And so while we have had lots of focus on PBMs, we haven't had a lot of focus on the actual plans. And those are the state plans, right? And so it's Medicaid, Medicare Advantage, right? And then the other state plans like state employees and retirement. So I was just wondering if that would be something for the future to think about.
I think one thing we talked before was inviting people in the public domain that use PBMs. Is again back to the same thing. We pull them together and talk about a strategy.
Well, except I think what that showed is that it was regardless of the PBM. So it's what's above that.
But correct that, I think on the same page. The question about the PBM is that with that whole process, either we could do it through a common PBM, or do we come up with a strategy above the PBM, which I think you're trying to get to, that people are working with collectively for all the public payers.
Right. So my take home from today was that we need to hear from the plans to understand what they're doing in their contracting with PBMs, what they're doing outside of the PBMs to monitor utilization and cost. Is that, and that was for me the big take home, is that it didn't matter which PBM you had, there's still opportunities for cost savings. And that comes back to the plan and how tightly it's run, how well it's run, you know, how closely they're monitoring utilization, and what do we call that dose, how much is being dispensed, all of those.
Correct. The question would be is who's actually managing it? Are they turning it over completely to the PBM, or are they themselves hiring somebody else that
Well, I
add
think that's
additional
why we need to hear from the
plans.
plans to understand what they're doing at the plan level. That's my record, that's my feeling.
which I think goes back to what I mentioned before, is that we talk about overall drug cost. It's not always the cost of the drug, it's the utilization, it's the waste. There's so many factors that go into this. Is that even though, in essence, we may not have all the pricing report or the cost reports and stuff we're all talking about, that's only a piece of it. And I think a bigger piece of it's going to be some of the other things we touched upon today. But before I go, I know Dr. Sherman has a tight time here. So I would like to take a couple of moments to put a couple things before the board. We'll still have the board on a quorum. Number one is we have the minutes from May meeting or in your packet. If I can have a motion on the board to accept the minutes, or if you want a chance to review them.
So moved.
Moved by Dr. Woodward, any seconds? Second, Dr. Ezzy, thank you. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Ayes have it. The other one too, we talked about is the MOU. We're in a process of revising the MOU based upon the HB2 language, which is basically taken the fees out of assessment fees and putting in the state budget. And you'll see on your packet, the only thing we had as a change, recommendation as a change, is on page 2. This is with Attorney Barry, is the change 3.1. The funding is coming from general fund appropriations versus assessment fees, which is what's in the budget. And then number 2 is that we talked about 3.2. The department shall assist the board with establishing, maintaining an account to administer appropriated funds versus fees.
That's a question for Attorney Barry. So on 3.1, if for some reason HB2 does not pass in its current form and we accept this MOU, then we're stuck with no funding.
Honestly, the language I have in front of me. I know I wrote it, but
We can make it contingent fund, except
Well, that's what I would,
add a contingency.
yeah, add a contingency that the board receives its funding. Yeah, if HB2 as amended by the House, or however you want to phrase it.
Sure.
Or if HB2 as passed by the Senate, because that will include the amendment presumably.
Yep.
Provides the general funding, then this kicks in.
Okay.
But if it doesn't, then we're,
Reverts back to.
then we
goes back.
revert back.
Sure. I can do that.
I believe there was another contingency just, which is,
No, that's on the next one. That's not on the MOU. That's on the motion I'm gonna make.
oh,
for
okay,
Cindy.
okay.
So it's a separate motion. It's going to basically, the MOUs is accepted by the board with the contingency that HB2 as written today remains intact.
Okay,
Yeah, is the funding
Is the
through
funding.
HB2.
Correct.
Right.
And if that disappears, then we're back to,
right, got that, but
Maybe
then we're not concerned about the executive director funding also. Right.
So, and 3.2 would also have the same contingency.
I can do that. Yep.
So I would move to accept, do we have to have a vote?
yes,
I would move to accept the MOU with the changes in wording in 3.1 and 3.2 to recognize the contingency that the budget has not yet passed.
it's contingent on the budget passing as written.
Would that not also the budget passing and the 2-year funding for the executive director?
That's the next motion.
Okay.
So the motion on the floor by Dr. Sherman is that we will approve, the board will approve the MOU with, as revised, contingent upon HB2 funding remaining as it stated today in the,
And the repeal of our fee structure.
Second,
second. Any more discussion? All those in favor say aye. Any opposed? Ayes have it. And the other one we talked about, Dr. Woodward, was the one dealing with the assessment fees, which I think is what.
Right, so since Senator Rosenwald's not here, I'll make the motion. What is the section of our bill that reflects this? Do we need that in this?
Numerous section.
Pull out the old.
This is the assessment. Well, basically, the board has the capacity to waive assessment of fees. So at this point, I'm trying to think of how to phrase this so that it is a temporary waiver contingent, but I was going to use the words for now, but that's not very fair. For now, the board will waive pending assessment fees contingent on passage of HB2 with language that includes $250,000 per year of funding from general funds and the support of an executive director position for at least 2 years from the date of hire. So that was 2 separate actions that that have occurred. So we want to make sure that those two things happen. But for now, we are going to waive the fees as we are allowed to do,
Contingent upon.
contingent upon.
Second.
More discussion? All those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? The ayes have it. It's good. This is part of it. And
Can I do my letter real quick?
your letter is the other one. Just
And then-
letter in your packet here. I asked Dr. Sherman to start formulating or pulling together the advisory council, which is also in the 126 BB 4. So there's a letter in your packet about, he just wants to send it out to notify the board that this is what he's process setting up.
So you probably haven't had a lot of time to read this, but it's pretty simple. So as you recall, the statute, the board formed, or an advisory council was formed, and the idea is that the advisory council is not oversight of the board. The advisory council is an advisory role with the board so that strategies, recommendations are made in consultation with the advisory council. So if you look at the membership, which is in this letter, the membership of the advisory council, it's really sort of the state of New Hampshire. And so what I wanted to do was to refresh the recipient of this, and the recipients of this letter would be the governor's office, commissioner, so everybody who is impacted by it. So we would need to have the letterhead from us, but also the name of the recipient. So it would be individual letters going out to each of these people who would be impacted, whether they are serving or whether they designate somebody else to serve. And then this would be coming from Chairman Merchant. And as soon as members of the advisory council have been named, that's Representative Merchant, or the executive director will convene an organizational meeting. And we are going to continue our work in the meantime. But it's pretty simple. And I'm absolutely open to edits or other suggestions.
I have a comment, not necessarily an edit, because it relates to the statute and the composition of the advisory board. That might be better
Okay.
served for a different time, but I thought I'd bring it up. Is that I think that would be remiss to not have somebody representing insurance on there, given that any recommendations and operating functions of this committee would have a big impact, but be affected by that. So to not have that representation, I think would be a mistake. And the second thing, I think maybe since this language was created, the university system of New Hampshire has merged with the New Hampshire Community College system, so that may be.
No, it hasn't worked. No, they're two separate entities.
So I'm not sure that if there's too many, sometimes advisory board can have too many people, so I thought that may be one that we could consolidate and put representation in there, either from the insurance industry or the insurance department as a state agency.
Yeah, I think one way to solve that is to understand, and I don't know the answer to this, who provides their insurance. So, you know, I think the goal here is to make sure that people who would be impacted by, you know, recommendations on plans would have a say, you know, be consulted. And so I think you've got a great point. Remember, these don't have any, these are advisory only. So if it's a little bit weighted one way or, I agree 100% with insurance. The other part of the statute that I'd love to see us fix is the formula that is in there, that rigid formula. So changing that paragraph and making it a little more broad so that we're not held to a formula that all of us are concerned about whether it has any validity. So I agree, but that kind of change would have to be made in statute. And since you're here, we have great representation.
I hear totally what you're saying. The only thing which I'm not sure of when I talk to someone from a legal point of view, because the statute says it shall consist of the following members, whether we have any latitude to add to it. I don't disagree at all with what you're saying.
My presumption is that that would take a legislative change.
Right, that's
I
what
think so.
that's what I think.
I think so.
So I wanted to get on the record as saying that, so that maybe next year,
No,
by the
I
time
think
this
that's-
board starts to become populated, that we can consider that.
That would make sense.
Yeah.
I'll be more than glad to work with whoever I'm trying to amend the statute. Yeah, it's a good recommendation. All right, so the letter I think is fine. I will make a side note to consider revision to the statute, at least a bill for it.
We don't need a vote on it.
No, no, it's just informational.
And if you see any edits, just make sure that you let the chair know.
And also we have some good news. I think it's good news.
My goodness.
I asked Lori Spring to be here talking about the journey we've had in trying to get a executive director position through the gauntlet. And I think we've, at that point now, we can say we're pretty close, or?
We are pretty close. So on May 26th, the Joint Committee for Employee Classification ratified a letter grade range of GG, which is a salary range from $79,430 to $110,682 annually. So we have a set salary. Right now, there's a little bit of administrative work. We've got to identify office space for this person. That's an element that's required by DAS when we're creating a new position. And the funding, as we understand, would be effective beginning July 1st of 2023. So we should have our new position number on or after July 1st. And at that point, once we have the new position number, we can go ahead and post. So we would be posting in this state system, New Hampshire First, and that would be available to both internal and external applicants. So broad visibility. And then from that point, I would recommend, I know this is going to be a bit of a challenging position to recruit for. So I would recommend connecting with Victoria Davis, who is the Talent Acquisition Manager here at HHS. And at that point, I think Vicki can help guide through doing things like promoted posts on LinkedIn, targeting external marketing through professional boards and things of that nature, where you might be able to more specifically target candidates that have the background and experience that you're looking for.
We want the guy from Maryland.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, we
So,
met a great candidate.
Yeah, we did.
Very early on.
oh goodness, yeah, so potentially, we're hoping in early July that we will have this position posted for the board.
So in saying that, do we have to have sort of some people, members of the board, to go through the applicants? If we have any applicants that actually apply to decide whether to bring someone forth to the board? What's the
Yes.
process we would use that way?
So functionally, the way New Hampshire First is set up, we actually have to have an employee of Health and Human Services who is receiving the application. So Attorney Barry actually offered to be the the person to help facilitate that. So he will have access to go in and retrieve any resumes, and then he would share those with the board so that you can review and, you know, ultimately determine what your process is going to look like when it comes to interviewing and ultimately making an offer. Because it's an unclassified position, the requirements are slightly less restricted than they would be for a position in classified service. So there's a bit of flexibility. But yes, we would rely on Attorney Barry to be sharing documents with the board so you can be reviewing candidates.
And to review candidates,
Mhm.
we need to have less than 3 board members Because at that point in time, if you have 3 or more, we have a quorum, which causes a problem as far as public notice.
Right.
What the question, which I don't know, is if we have an alternate, are they considered part of the quorum? And I don't know.
I think there's,
That's a Sherry question.
Sherry, sorry, Attorney Phillips?
Yep, I'm here.
Yeah, okay. So the question to yourself, when there's 3 voting members present, we have a quorum. However, if we have 2 board members who are board members, not alternates, can we include alternates without jeopardizing the violation of a quorum?
Hang on, I'm just double checking.
just while she's checking, I think the bigger question is, what do commissions, committees that are staffed, how do they, what's the selection process? Do they form a subcommittee that would be less than their quorum? Or do they, so that they can vet them and bring them to the public once they've vetted them, or does the whole process have to be public, which would potentially put applicants at risk? So this is not, there's no way this is the first time anybody's ever done this. So I'm wondering what the protocol is for a board such as ours.
So that does go outside of my area of expertise, so I would recommend, oh.
And so I can speak to this.
Okay.
The interview should take place in a confidential space. At the point you're ready to make an offer or make them public is when you would bring it to the public.
So how can you do that? I think this is,
Well, that's where Sherry comes in. about the
okay.
quorum
That's
issue.
quorum.
Because I'm not quite sure what the answer to that is, but yeah, interviews should be done confidentially.
And that's completely okay with the right to know.
At that stage, yes,
As long as it's not a quorum.
yes.
Quorum, if I understand it, if you have 2 regular members there, an alternate can come in and be a quorum if they're taking the place of a particular member who's not there.
But we can't have more than 2 working on something without having to publicly disclose it. Is that correct?
Right, I mean, technically, if you have less than a quorum working on it, it doesn't constitute a quote unquote meeting, but most of these, in order to vote anything in, you would still need the quorum.
So the question, I guess, in order to ensure we have enough people reviewing a meeting with a candidate, or hopefully there's candidates, at that point in time, is that we only have right now 2 permanent board members. But if we have 2 permanent board members and we have alternates that come also to that meeting and they don't get elevated to a permanent member, we haven't created a quorum. Or have we?
If I may, Attorney Phelps, I believe there's an exception in right to know law about personnel matters.
Right.
Being
Oh.
exempt from right to know. I don't have the language in front of me, so I'm hesitant to quote it, but I would assume that would apply here in some capacity.
Yes, it feels like we're confusing a number of things. If you only have two permanent members now, then an alternate can come forward to take the, to stand in for a permanent member who's not there, according to 126BB:2, to make your quorum. If the issue is, do you want to have a confidential, non-public meeting, the personnel matters, yes, are exempt under the right to know law. So that information or what goes on in that meeting would not be available to the public, but that's separate from the quorum issue, I think.
So that's the big issue. So can we do our interviews of candidates? Could we have the entire board there if they wanted to be, which I think would be best?
Yeah.
And do it as a non-public personnel related meeting if, for the purposes of these initial interviews?
Yes, under, I think Rob's 100% right. Under 91A, personnel matters are exempt.
Okay, that's it.
solved that.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you, solved that problem.
One other question, as we become aware of the job announcement, is it possible for us to share that with like my academic colleagues? Separately, it doesn't, you've got to do all of the public announcements, but other activity, other dissemination of the information is possible.
Absolutely.
One last question. As far as the meeting with a candidate, does that have to be in person or can we have board members come in via Zoom? Since we're not having a public meeting.
Yeah, but to have a non-public, to have,
Yes.
if a quorum of the members is present, which you would be here, what you're having is a non-public meeting. You're gonna seal the minutes. Okay, so that has to, you have to have a quorum present, and then if there are other members who want to Zoom in, that's fine, but you still have to have the quorum present in person. And you would, yeah, and you would basically open up in public, go into non-public, do whatever you have to do, seal the minutes and come back out.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
the good news.
Of course.
One quick, I've been working with Dr. Woodward on the first data bank. He's trying to work with UNH on it as well. So hopefully you have something up to date at the next meeting to let us know what's going on, because it's a robust database and I think it would be helpful to us. Before I know, because Dr. Sherman has to leave. It's okay. So next meeting is going to be August 20. Yeah, we'll meet again. No, we skipped July. I think it was August, last Monday in August.
Last Monday?
Twenty-eight.
Senator Rosenwald tried to rejoin, but she said there was no Zoom link, so she didn't know how. It was the original one.
8/28. And what I'll be doing, just that, again, announcement to the board, is working with Dr. Woodward and probably Dr. Izek about the annual report. And the reason for being, they both have two primary responsibilities. Dr. Woodward's dealing along with the pharmacy benefit side of the equation, of which a lot of NEC numbers and so forth that there. Dr. Aziz is doing the same thing on the medical side with drugs and the medical benefit. So the two of them are working in two different buckets, but they're connected ultimately. So we have to bring them together in the annual report. So over the next couple of months, I'd like to do is get something to the board as a draft, at least an outline at the August meeting. Then hopefully by the September meeting, we'll have a draft for the board to sign off on. And if we have to make any last minute revisions, we can do that at the very end of October in time to meet the November 1st deadline.
Sounds good. But there's other sections of the annual report, which are the review of the agenda of each of the monthly meetings. Can we ask you to do that?
What are you asking? I'm sure I can provide. but what-
The
what was
minutes.
that? Just provide you.
So the first annual report that you put together,
Yes,
not last year, but the year before,
yes.
had very nice summaries of the minutes and the slides,
Mhm.
sort of all in separate sections. Can you compile, I guess I'm asking whether it would be reasonable to,
Yeah, let's connect. And I'll get you whatever you need or whatever you need.
No, the original one.
make the framework of the annual report into which Jason and I can plot chapters.
Okay, I'll work on it.
Senator Roosevelt trying to get back in. She's apparently the link's not working.
I mean, there's 2 minutes left in the meeting and I'm not really sure how to get.
She's
her
looking at
activated
the
and all that.
non-public. I think she's probably trying to click on the non-public.
No, she said she was trying to get back on the original one. She couldn't, but everybody else did.
I really want to, you, quickly, do you think, do you think this is possible to go through in a relatively short period of time?
Yeah,
Or should we wait until? we go through
Yeah,
it?
we've already talked about it.
Most of it, right? Yeah, so I want to be sure we give you your fair due, and I want you to.
Yeah, I think
Feel
it's
slight,
straightforward. It doesn't
Okay.
affect us for lots of
Okay,
questions.
all right.
Um,
Make sure.
Let me share it.
Yeah.
I think so. Can you X out of this?
No doubt.
Sure, yeah.
Okay, yeah, we talked a lot about this, so I just want to give you a background and show you some graphical representations of what might be in the CMS or RxDC. So this is actually under a federal law, which I think is significant and has importance to us because under state law, we can require carriers to submit their claims data, but ERISA plans, so self-funded employee-sponsored plans are preempted and don't have to submit to the choose data, and indeed many of them don't. So that's a gap in representativeness that we have, and that this CMS RxDC data might be able to fill that gap. Time will tell if that's really true. So this is the result. So RxDC stands for prescription drug data collection. And it's not only about prescription drugs, it also includes total healthcare spending, carrier premium paid, and enrollment data. So we can get a good kind of snapshot, if nothing at all, use this as a reference data set to assess the fidelity of the measures we get from measures.
Do they have those? You want questions?
Well, yeah, we're not sure yet. So the primary purposes of the CMS RxDC are to identify the major drivers of increases in prescription drug and total healthcare spending, understand how prescription drug rebates impact premiums and cost sharing, and promote prescription drug price transparency. These are all central objectives to this board, so it's a specific importance and aligns nicely with what we're looking to learn. So I wanted to spend time talking about this. There are 11 different files of reporting parameters. You can see some similar parameters in our statute. Some of them are similar to 126 BB5. So the top, we're required to report the top 25 most frequently prescribed drugs, most costly drugs, and drugs that have the highest year-to-year spending increase. Here they have the top 50, which the 25 are obviously included. Rebate information is also available. Total rebates and rebates by therapeutic class, and plan enrollment files. So this is where it's important. This includes FEHBs, which are federal employee health benefit plans, which is one of the gaps in New Hampshire CHIS. So the data, as states, we don't have as much control or authority to get this and to require carriers submit it. So federal government has that authority. The first output files are expected this July in readable Excel or CSV files. And some of the outputs will be stratified by state level, so we can see exactly what's going on in the state of New Hampshire. So there's some advantages that it's free. It's another lens for us to do prescription drug pricing in the state of New Hampshire. And it may allow for us to identify the public payers, which can be challenging using the choose data. And some of the disadvantages is the lack of control that we as a state have to demand compliance, to regulate compliance. And CMS may not this year have a really good reporting compliance framework already set in place, given that it's the first year. So that's it.
That was quick. Question though, as far as the database, is the database including drugs utilized in clinics and hospitals, or is it only going to be drugs used on the pharmacy benefit that we normally think about as the PBM side.
Yeah, I mean, well, I'm not sure how we might learn to query that. I think there's a learning curve is based on how it's coded and, you know, we do know in the CHIS data, they have a site of service parameter, so we can find out was it, you know, was it prescribed in a clinic or inpatient hospital. We talked earlier about codes, whether it's an NDC code may suggest that it was paid for through pharmacy, or if it's a HCPCS2 code could indicate whether it was delivered in a medical clinic or hospital. And so we may end up relying on that. Those are proxy approaches, meaning they're reliable approaches, but not 100% sensitive and specific. Meaning there may be some gaps, and I think lots can be learned about how that's done. Compliance will be the key feature to that. So when we get those data, there's a lot of validity testing we can do to check to see if it matches trends that we see in the CHIS, which we know lots more about.
Also, I want to call out to Dr. Aziz, sorry. We were on a call, national call the other day with some other states dealing with price transparency and so forth, and he actually raised this question, and it was crickets. So I want to commend you for being on the forefront of this, not just here in the state of New Hampshire, but I think even nationally. People aren't thinking about it in the ways you're trying to accomplish things, so I wanted to call that out.
Thank you.
So, any more? Before I open up to public comments, anybody out there? Are we, we're still there?
Okay.
All right, with that, I'll adjourn the meeting at 12:05.
Thank you.
Thank you.